Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine, and we're very excited to have with us this evening Washington Post journalist Craig Whitlock, who's here to talk about his new book, Fat Leonard, How One Man Bribed, Bilked, and Seduced the U.S. Navy. Craig's an investigative reporter who specializes in national security issues. He came to the Washington Post about 26 years ago after stints at a couple of newspapers in the South. At the Post, he went from covering local and state stories to serving as a foreign correspondent, a Pentagon reporter, and national security specialist. He's won a bunch of awards and been a Pulitzer Prize finalist 3 times. So any year now, he's bound to get one. His previous book, 3 years ago, The Afghanistan Papers, provided a searing account of America's mistakes, mismanagement, and missed opportunities in what became our country's longest war. When it comes to military scandals, though, it's hard to rival in scope and outright brazenness the Fat Leonard saga. And Craig, overcoming Navy resistance to letting the whole story out, has nonetheless managed through his own dogged reporting to expose the full extent of the shameful and damaging corruption. For 25 years, Leonard Glenn Francis and his Singapore-based company played a critical role supporting the Navy's 7th Fleet, which operates in the Western Pacific and the Indian Oceans. But Francis ultimately was found to have been bribing scores of military officers with gifts and parties, bilking millions and millions of dollars from defense contracts, and even recruiting a network of moles inside the U.S. Navy by targeting officers with various vulnerabilities. Nearly 1,000 people were eventually swept up in the investigation, including 685 U.S. service members, among them 91 admirals. Although only one admiral has ended up going to prison, and while many more enlisted sailors and junior officers have been punished more harshly, and I'm sure Craig will get into those disparities in the way this whole thing has played out. Craig himself started covering the scandal in the fall of 2013, soon after Francis's arrest in San Diego. And the more Craig wrote about it, he says in the preface of his book, the more he realized the story was much, much bigger and more damning for the Navy than federal authorities were letting on. So he pursued it even after the Navy stopped responding to his FOIA requests. In time, Craig gained access to, among other revealing material, the case files of the federal agents involved in the investigation. The book is a terrific feat of investigative reporting and really reads like a thriller. Now, in conversation with Craig this evening will be Nancy Youssef, a national security correspondent at the Wall Street Journal, where she's been for 3 years. Previously, she covered defense and national security affairs for the Daily Beast, BuzzFeed News, and the McClatchy newspapers. And before that, she worked for the Detroit Free Press and Baltimore Sun. But she also really knows the military, so we've got a great conversation partner for Craig this evening. Please join me in welcoming Craig Whitlock and Nancy Youssef.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in what I hope will be a lively conversation about a very lively person. In preparation for today's event, I was looking up the Fat Leonard scandal on Wikipedia. And if you type in the name Craig Whitlock, it comes up more often then Glenn Defense Marine Asia, the husbanding company that was the main driver and at the center of what allowed Leonard Francis to do what he did. And so I think it really speaks to how committed Craig has been to covering the story and how much he's kept it at the fore of the public discourse. And so 10 years is a long time to commit to a story. And I wanted to know if you could start by walking us through, Craig, what made you sort of give so much of your journalistic skill to this and help us understand sort of what the Fat Leonard scandal was and what a husbanding service is, the service that he provided that allowed or was the driver behind all of this.
Yeah, so back in 2013, Nancy and I were both beat reporters at the Pentagon. One of the great things I loved about Nancy is soon after I started on the beat, you could tell that all the generals and admirals and everybody else at the Pentagon was scared of her. And I always had great admiration for that. And so I always followed her lead on lines of inquiry. But it was in 2013, it was, you all maybe remember the Navy Yard massacre when there was a shooting at the Navy Yard in DC, and a civilian contractor there just went off and started killing people. He was mentally ill. But on that same day at the Navy Yard shooting, there was an arrest in San Diego of a Navy contractor named Leonard Glenn Francis. And in addition to Francis being arrested on corruption and bribery charges, there were two Navy personnel who were also charged with bribery. One was a Navy officer who had been in the news a few years earlier for making a triumphant return to Cambodia. He was a native of Cambodia, had fled Cambodia as a 5-year-old son, fled the killing fields and the genocide there. He was adopted by an American servicewoman, went to the Naval Academy and rose through the ranks of the Navy and went back to Cambodia as the captain of a US Navy destroyer. And this was, this moment in the sun for the Navy and for him. So he was arrested on bribery charges. And in addition to him, there was a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. So a federal law enforcement agent was also arrested on bribery charges. So this caught my attention, and yet all the news coverage in Washington, understandably, was a focus on the Navy Yard massacre. So after a few weeks, I was following this case from afar. There had been a couple of AP wire reports about these arrests, and I was wandering through the halls of the corridors of the Pentagon, and I bumped into a Navy officer I knew. I said, "Do you know anything about this guy, Leonard Francis, this contractor?" And this Navy officer got a big smile on his face and said, "Oh, you mean Fat Leonard?" And my eyes got big, and I said, "Really? His name's Fat Leonard?" He goes, "Everybody in the Navy knows Fat Leonard." And so that hooked me, right? You've got an unusual case of bribery, very unusual, involving a Navy officer, law enforcement agent, but this character named Fat Leonard, who everybody in the Navy knew, just made me want to know more. So from that point forward, I wrote a page one story in the Washington Post, but at that point, we only knew the tip of the scandal. Even the Justice Department wasn't aware of how many people had been caught up in it. And over the next few years, there were these steady drips of additional people getting arrested or indicted. And so I just, as any reporter, just wanted to keep at it and kept chipping away. And there were so many twists and turns in the whole story. I won't get into all of them, but here we are more than 10 years later, and the story's still unfolding. So it's been a fantastic, it's been the best story of my career in terms of interest and scope and sordidness and corruption, and it's got all the elements in it.
Do me a favor and tell people what a husbanding service is.
So
that was the company he...
Leonard Francis owned a company called Glenn Defense Marine Asia, and it was based in Singapore, but he was a husbanding contractor, and by that he provided supplies whenever a Navy ship pulled into port in Southeast Asia, or even from Japan on down to Australia. Whenever they pulled into a foreign civilian port, a Navy ship needed supplies, right? Fresh water, needed food, needed fuel, needed security, needed tugboats, barges. And Leonard's company, over 25 years, essentially gained a monopoly on providing all of these services throughout Asia. It's important to keep in mind that the Navy's biggest fleet is in the Asia Pacific, the US 7th Fleet. So almost half of the Navy's forward deployed ships and submarines at any given time are in the 7th Fleet area. So Leonard Francis was really not just did he have a big business, he played a huge role in US Navy operations in essentially half of the world. So this story unfolding over 25 years, he's a critical player in military operations, in addition to being one of the biggest crooks and con men you'll ever hear about.
You know, you used the word character earlier, and I think that's an important one in this book because one of the reasons it's such a page turner is his personality and the ways that he sort of frankly groomed service members to be lured into these traps. And so as I read it, it just seemed that one was his character and at play against the character of those sailors. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, what was it about Leonard Francis that allowed him to be so successful at drawing those sailors in? And what were some of the character deficiencies in some of those sailors that made them so susceptible to his schemes?
So Leonard Francis he's a charming rogue. He's a villain in the book. He's kind of an anti-hero, but he's undoubtedly a real charmer. And he knew how to sidle up to people, to be friendly, to gain their confidence. And it was he had a real magnetic personality. His origins are different because he was actually a high school dropout. And most people in the Navy were unaware of this. And he had actually spent time in prison as a young man on gun crimes. So if you look on paper, you think this is not a guy who should be charming his way into senior levels of the US Navy. But he even though he was a dropout from high school, he's extraordinarily smart. A lot of people call him brilliant. And in addition to being such a good con man, having that personality, he was a master of espionage. He was able to con people in the Navy into giving him military secrets. And so on one hand, while it's funny and you may laugh and he's entertaining, he's also represents a real national security threat to the Navy. He was able to penetrate the senior levels of command like nobody else has done, even in the Cold War.
Yeah. You mentioned at the beginning of the book the amount of data that was available, terabytes worth. And I noticed that you used 3 of them as sort of a connective thread to tell the story of this scandal. One of them are Bravo Zulus, which I'll ask you to describe what those are. Another is the menus that were of the meals, these extravagant meals that were served at all over the Asia Pacific to these sailors. And the other is Leonard's weight. Given all the data that you had in front of you, why did you pick those 3? What do you think that they illustrated to the reader about the scandal?
So one reason I've been writing this story for 10 years is it took me that long to get to the bottom of it, right? And I wish it could have happened quicker, but the Navy was really digging its heels in terms of not releasing public information. So it took me a long time using every method I've learned over 35 years as a reporter in terms of coaxing people for information or public records or court records or just getting people to slip me information. And in the end, it was able to piece together this story using all sorts of data points, as you pointed out. But one advantage I had was that Leonard Francis was a pack rat. He kept everything for 25 years. He was very proud of the job he did with the US Navy. So even though on one hand he's fleecing US taxpayers and he's bribing people, he's proud that he's this key cog in the US Navy operations. He felt patriotic, even though he was a Malaysian citizen. He felt like he was part of the US Navy, and he kept everything as memorabilia, but also for blackmail purposes. So whenever he had emails from US Navy officers saying, "Thanks, Leonard, for the gift. Thanks, Leonard, for that wonderful meal you threw last night for us," or "Thanks for the girls," which a number of them did, or when he'd take photographs, he kept everything. He literally kept it in storehouses and warehouses over 25 years. So eventually I got my hands on most of that stuff. And you mentioned one thing, the menu. So Leonard, when he would throw dinner parties for people in the Navy, for officers from a visiting destroyer or carrier strike group, Leonard just didn't throw dinner parties. You had to have the finest Michelin-starred restaurants in Asia. And these dinners would sometimes cost $600, $700, $800, $1,000 a person. And a lot of it was on not just alcohol, but it had to be the finest champagnes. And he'd import pastries from France, and you name it, foie gras. And so anytime you had a dinner, you had a customized menu, right? If you go, they don't just order a la carte off the menu. It's got to be a customized menu courtesy of Mr. Leonard Glenn Francis for members of the USS Cowpens or the USS Nimitz. And so he would keep these customized menus, which were a wonderful description of just how ostentatious these gifts he were providing. It's also important to keep in mind that in the US Navy, as well as the rest of the federal government, there's a strict rule that ethics rule that you can't accept gifts worth more than $20 from any federal contractor at a time. And yet here's Leonard giving out these fantastic meals that are worth, multitudes more than that. So that enabled me to sort of tell the story of these wonderful spreads he put on. You also mentioned Bravo Zulu letters. Bravo Zulu is a term in the Navy that essentially means good job or well done. So whenever a Navy officer or commanding officer wanted to send out an attaboy to someone in the Navy or to an institution, they send out what's known as a Bravo Zulu letter. And Leonard coveted these. He wanted these Bravo Zulu letters every time a ship came in for a port visit in Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or Hong Kong or Tokyo, because this was essentially an endorsement of his services. And then he would hoard these things. He would actively seek them out, because then he would submit them as part of his contract bids to say, look, the admiral said I did a great job. But what he wouldn't say is the reason he got these endorsement letters is because he took the admiral out to a $1,000 meal the night before. But he was very clever. He understood how the Navy worked. He was very systematic in the way he bribed people and got more contracts for the Navy, and the way he avoided getting in trouble for so long. He was a brilliant criminal, and he really understood the Navy better than they understood him.
And his weight?
His weight. So, this isn't meant to fat shame Leonard Francis, but everybody in the Navy knew him by this name. And as the more reporting I did, the more apparent it became that this was, in a way, perversely, a secret to his success, because Leonard was a big guy. He's as tall as I am. He's 6'3", but he weighs about 150 more pounds. And his weight fluctuated greatly. Most time he's around 350 pounds, but for a number of years, he was up to 500. He was a big guy, right? And he had to have gastric bypass surgery just to get down to 350. Everybody in the Navy knew him as Fat Leonard, but it also caused them to underestimate him, right? They thought, well, how much trouble could this fat guy be? They really saw him as this jolly, large guy who was always throwing parties. They didn't see him as a threat to national security. So in a way, that helped his legend, as it were, and made it easier for him to pull the wool over the eyes on people in the Navy.
One thing that I think we underestimate, and I think is a necessary element for this scandal to go on as long as it did, is he did provide an effective service. He wasn't just taking people out on parties and buying them fancy meals and buying their wives fancy bags. He did provide a service that nobody else did. You tell a story about the USS Nimitz pulling into Chennai in India for the first time, and he was the only husbanding service that could take care of the ships. How much was that a factor in keeping the scandal going? Could it have gone on if he wasn't able to provide the service?
So Leonard figured something else, another truth about the Navy and other branches of the military is, as long as you provide reliable service, they don't care what you charge them, right? They don't care what it costs. The mission comes first, cost comes second, third, or fourth. And Leonard knew this. And so as long as he was there and his barges and tugboats and refueling and food resupply was on time, he knew that most people in the Navy really didn't care how much he charged or overcharged. So that was a critical aspect of it. And he was pretty reliable. His service was pretty good. It wasn't perfect. Certainly he would overcharge the Navy through the nose. Essentially, he was bribing people in the Navy to look the other way so he could overcharge them anytime his ship came into port. And he would overcharge for everything, right? He had one good illustration. One of his most reliable scams was anytime a ship came into port, it needed to have the sewage pumped out, right? When you're in port, you can't just dump it in the harbor. And Leonard would always overcharge. He would claim that his company pumped out twice as much sewage as the ship's tanks were able to hold, right? And it was obvious of a ripoff, but he would get supply officers who he'd taken out to dinner or taken out to sex party, he would get them to sign off on his inflated invoices. It was a real brazen quid pro quo. But again, as long as he was giving the Navy what it had asked for in terms of service, most people really didn't care how much he charged.
The other thing that strikes me is, this went on, as you know, for decades. But people had seen a problem. People felt uncomfortable with what he was doing. He wasn't able to bribe everyone. People would come forward. They'd go to headquarters. They detailed examples of just egregious behavior. And yet every time, up until the investigation that led to his downfall, he slipped through. How was he able to do that? What was he doing to avert this coming forward sooner?
Well, it wasn't just that Leonard slipped through. He had his own counter defenses, right? He had so many informants and moles strategically placed in the Navy. They always gave him a heads up if there was an investigation starting or if there was a complaint filed against his company. So he had moles in the contracting offices for the Navy in Singapore. He had moles at Pacific Fleet headquarters in Hawaii. He had moles at 7th Fleet flagship, the USS Blue Ridge. He had moles in NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. So he had moles everywhere that he had carefully cultivated over time. And these people always gave him a heads up whenever people were starting to circle his company or ask difficult questions. And so really his defenses were better than any offense the Navy could go on. So the best illustration of this was NCIS, the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. You've all seen the TV series, right? TV series is nothing compared to what they actually do. They're a law enforcement agency for the Navy. They have agents on ships and based overseas to investigate fraud, to sexual assault, to provide force protection for Navy ships in foreign ports. Over the years, they had opened more than 24 criminal investigations into Leonard's company based on fraud complaints. And every one of them went away because Leonard always had an answer, or you had people on the inside feeding him the information on how to defeat these cases. So Leonard, in fact, he became so hubristic, so overconfident that he could defeat any of these investigations that he would almost brag about it. He'd say, oh, another investigation. What is it this time, right? He was never worried about it because he knew he could always defeat them.
The other thing that jumped out at me as a Pentagon correspondent is there were a lot of familiar names in this book. Gilday, Roughhead, Locklear, people who became chief of naval operations. And the book is also peppered with stories of lower ranked officers. Some of them you have some empathy for, some of them you're totally disgusted with. But they always seem to take the rap much heavier than these admirals. How are the admirals not only able to slip and not face charges, but continue to rise through the ranks while lower ranking officers paid so much more relatively to their commanders whose lead they were following in some cases and allowing them to continue this behavior?
So as you've heard this, I'm sure, Nancy, but in the military, there's this very descriptive phrase called different spanks for different ranks. And by that means that, the admirals get away with a slap on the wrist, and if an enlisted sailor had done the same thing, they get kicked out. There's no tolerance. Particularly if you're an enlisted sailor, you can't screw up. There's no margin for error. If you're late to a meeting, if your uniform's on wrong, you can get court-martialed technically for it. But if you're an admiral and you went to Leonard's parties or you slept with one of his prostitutes, in the end, as I discovered in my reporting, those people weren't getting in trouble. As Brad Graham had mentioned in the introduction, there were 91 admirals. I found out, and it wasn't that the Navy's ever disclosed this publicly, but in doing my reporting, found out there were 91 admirals who were questioned or investigated for their interactions with Leonard Francis, and only one of them spent any time in prison. So there's clearly a pattern here where the admirals were let off the hook, and not only let off the hook, or their cases were buried, despite reporters asking about them frequently. And the people who got indicted or charged criminally or court-martialed were invariably lower-ranking officers or enlisted people. So that different spanks or different ranks is definitely borne out throughout this book.
I'm going to leave it to you, readers, to see how this all unravels, because it's just as much a page turner as the scandal itself. But I want to note that this all happened over the same period that the U.S. was focused on two ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had sailors in the furthest part of the country, the world relative to the Pentagon, and a Pentagon that was distracted arguably by the ground wars. How much was the focus on Iraq and Afghanistan a factor in keeping this going on as long as it did?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nancy. So really two main reasons. So Leonard's company really took off after 2001, after the 9/11 hijackings, but most importantly, after the bombing of the USS Cole in 2000 in Yemen, in the Persian Gulf. And the USS Cole, for those of you who don't remember, was a destroyer that had made a brief port visit in Aden, Yemen, and an al-Qaeda plot. This was just a motorboat, a small boat stuffed with explosives, pulled right up next to the destroyer, this multi-billion-dollar ship, and almost sank it, blew it up. The Navy was completely unprepared for this kind of asymmetric attack, and this completely changed their calculus on trying to protect their ships in Navy ports. And Leonard Francis, again, smart guy, saw an opportunity. He's like, I have to be able to guarantee the Navy that I can protect their ships when they're in foreign ports in Southeast Asia, because there were terrorist threats too in Southeast Asia, in places like Indonesia. And so Leonard invented this brilliant marketing device called the Ring of Steel. And he would use the Ring of Steel to surround ships whenever they were in port. And that sounds pretty impregnable, right? The Ring of Steel, but it was really just a circumference of barges linked together with steel cables that he would use to surround a ship. And he promised the Navy it would work to prevent any small motorboats stuffed with explosives from getting too close. Well, one of the revelations in the book is nobody ever bothered to test this thing to see if it would actually work. But Leonard could charge whatever he wanted because the Navy, again, they didn't care what it cost as long as he carried out the mission. So this was one, he definitely took advantage of this. And then after the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, there were more and more Navy ships crossing through Leonard's territory in Asia to get to the Persian Gulf. So they would invariably stop off in Leonard's territory, his ports in Singapore, Malaysia, Hong Kong, for what the Navy calls liberty ports, where they're just taking a few days break, vacation. Sailors go on ashore for a few days of relaxation. And that's when Leonard would throw his wild parties and cultivate his ties to the senior Navy leadership. So he took advantage in both of those ways. The third way you were talking about is this all happened halfway around the world, right? And so people in the Navy, there's a tradition really of what happens in the Western Pacific stays in the Western Pacific. It's kind of like if you go to Vegas, right? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So Leonard knew he could get away with things in terms of his parties and bribes that in the US he probably could never get away with. And so he sensed that early on about Navy culture and took full advantage of it.
The other thing that's changed since this all happened is we have more women in command of the United States Navy, including the CNO, the Chief of Naval Operations. You mentioned women in the book, but they show up periodically in terms of those in uniform. And one of the things that Leonard Francis does is also co-opt the wives of these sailors, buying them purses and luxury meals and everything else. Do you think if there had been more women within the ranks that this would have gone on as long as it did? Or did the absence of women play a role in perpetuating France's ability to exploit the United States Navy?
I think there's no question that had there been more female officers, particularly senior officers in the Navy, that this would have been much, much harder for Leonard to pull off. And Leonard took real advantage of what was still, definitely in the 90s and the early 2000s, a largely all-male good old boy culture where this kind of behavior that even today probably wouldn't be tolerated as much was back then. This was on the heels of the tailhook investigation and scandal in the early 1990s, this terrible sexual assault case that really paved the way for the Navy to bring more women, integrate them onto warships, and put them in higher levels of command. But I'll give you one story. In 2003, the USS Nimitz, an aircraft carrier, and its strike group made a port visit in Singapore. So this is 20 years ago now. And Leonard threw one of his wild parties on the helipad of a Singapore skyscraper at a Michelin-starred restaurant, and there were 20 girls come in at the end of dinner, and the strike group admiral was welcoming all this, right? This fancy dinner with the prostitutes. But there was one female officer who was actually the commanding officer of a destroyer that was part of the strike group. And she was there, and she was clearly very uncomfortable at this dinner, right? She was uncomfortable with how much it cost. She was uncomfortable with, the prostitutes wandering around. But what does she do? Her boss, the strike group admiral, is obviously having the time of his life, so she can't rebuke him right then and there. So the next day, she sends an email to the strike group commander and his chief of staff and says she's got to kind of thread the needle here, right? She has to make clear that she was uncomfortable with this, but she doesn't want to seem like she's questioning the boss, because you don't do that in the military. So she had this artful way of phrasing it. She said, I'm not sure what happened last night would pass the Washington Post front page test. And this is a thing in the Navy and the federal government, that if if the Washington Post writes about it on the front page, would you be okay with it? That was her way of saying, I don't think you'd be okay if the Post found out about this. And still the boss just kind of ignored her. And sure enough, they swept it under the rug. This was never made public. I only found out about it, getting my hands on all this material. So it took 20 years, but it doesn't pass a Washington Post front page test, right? But no doubt, if there had been more women in higher positions of leadership back then, I think Leonard would have had a much tougher time.
I'd be remiss if we didn't mention that one of the things that Leonard Francis was doing was using this bribery to get classified information, ship schedules to benefit his company, even details about missiles at one point. And so it's not just the scandal as we think about it, but one that really posed a real national security threat. At one point, China was sort of looking around his company to see if they could acquire information. And so it seems, as a reader of this book, you find yourself asking and worried, could another Fat Leonard scandal happen to the United States Navy? Has it safeguarded itself enough?
Yeah, I think the things, if you read the book, and you'll be stunned by, I was in reporting it, was just how easy it was for Leonard Francis to penetrate the Navy's counterintelligence defenses and get his hands on classified information. Over a period of 7 years, he was able to get 10 different Navy officers to leak him classified information, military secrets, on a regular basis. He even got a Royal Australian Navy officer who was a liaison to the U.S. 7th Fleet to leak him classified information. He was a really, really good spy. He was able to cultivate these people and bribe them for military secrets, which, as you know, is just, not given today's concerns about classified information, it's bad enough, but going back decades in the Navy, everybody knows the phrase, loose lips sink ships. You do not mess around with giving classified information to foreign nationals or people who aren't supposed to have it. But Leonard was able to get his hands in this stuff. And so I think that's an underappreciated aspect of this whole scandal, is what a threat it was Leonard posed to national security. And to this day, it's unclear to what degree Leonard was handed over these secrets, or they were hacked or accessed by a hostile foreign power such as China. Leonard says he didn't hand over any of his military secrets to another country, but he also didn't protect them. He left them strewn about his home and office in printouts. He kept them unprotected on his company's computer servers. So it would have been relatively easy for the Chinese government or another country to get their hands on this stuff. And the Navy, frankly, has not wanted to come public. It hasn't done any sort of public assessment of the damage caused to by this constant leak of classified information. So that's something, to this day, we still don't know the extent of it.
So you're saying it's very possible it could happen.
Absolutely.
So I've been watching the audience, and as we've been talking, they've been shaking their heads and mortified, which is what it's like to read the book. And so before I hand the microphone over to our audience, who I know will ask fabulous questions, I have one last one for you. How has the Navy reacted to all this? Your book, your coverage? How has Leonard Francis reacted to the book?
Well, the Navy's kind of adhering to that phrase, loose lips sink ships, so its lips are sealed. It hasn't said anything. I gave them every opportunity to comment, just like anyone named in the book, made clear what we were going to publish, and they've stayed silent. They haven't disputed a single word, but I think they do what the Navy does best when there's a storm. They kind of ride it out and hope for a better day to come. Leonard is happy with the book. I sent him a copy in prison. And he's very proud that the public is learning just how easy it was for him to penetrate the U.S. Navy and bribe people. He has a very big ego. He's very proud of what he's done, and he doesn't shy away from that. In fact, he likes all the media coverage, book coverage, all the stories we did in the Washington Post. He's a big fan of that sort of thing.
Who would have thought? Well, I want to invite our audience. You'll see a microphone here to come step up and ask questions, because we'd love to hear from you. Because I know we'll have a lot of people want to ask a question. If you can, keep your question as brief as possible so we can get to as many people as possible.
It's a shocking story indeed. But in one sense, the port expenses of the Pacific Fleet are a sort of potentially a tip of the iceberg, relatively small beer compared with what the Navy spends in capital contracts and in service and other services. To what extent do you worry that this is just the tip of the iceberg? Because the Navy is so susceptible to corruption, seemingly, because their auditing of their contracts is so weak, the NCIS doesn't do its job professionally. I mean, could this be almost a systemic issue in the U.S. Navy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on one hand, Leonard was an exceptional criminal, right? Not just anybody could pull off what he did. At the same time, he exposed all these vulnerabilities and how easy it is to bribe people, to rig contracts, to overcharge the Navy for things. And, the Navy had all these systems in place to prevent it, right? They had tons of contracting officers, ethics officers, lawyers. On paper, this never should have happened. But Leonard showed how easy it was if you're smart and you understand the system and you bribe people at the right time. He was an exceptional criminal, but he also definitely exposed that you can have all these processes on paper to deter corruption, but it still comes down to human nature. And a lot of people were susceptible to that. So great question.
First, I want to say to Nancy Youssef, I've been listening to you for years on television and on the radio. I can't afford the Wall Street Journal, but you're a terrific reporter, and I listen to everything you say.
Thank you.
Now, as to the Navy, have they, I understand, I was in the federal government for 20 years, how they've covered it up. Have they done anything to avoid this in the future? Do you think it's effective? And the book has been out now for a little bit, at least, because I've heard you before. Has Congress thought about stepping in now that they know the story?
Yeah, great questions. So the Navy, to be fair, has taken some steps to tighten up its processes, right? To make sure there's more oversight of contracts, to make sure things are put out to bid in a different manner. So, a lot of the things that Leonard exposed, they're kind of trying to plug those holes afterward. But as I said, what do you do about human nature? And I think that's the biggest problem that what this has exposed in terms of the Navy's culture.
Punish the admirals.
And rank and leadership. And it's done very little about that. In terms of Congress has done very little too. And part of that was the Navy learned very early on that they didn't want a repeat of the tailhook scandal from the 1990s when there were congressional hearings, many admirals, the Secretary of the Navy, they lost their job because Congress played a very aggressive oversight role. So the Navy was petrified this might happen again. So every time members of Congress or a congressional committee would ask the Navy to explain themselves about this scandal when there were bits and pieces coming out, as the Navy learned to say, oh, we can't possibly comment on that because it's under investigation by the Justice Department. We wouldn't want to interfere with an ongoing investigation. So this was their response time after time, which was true. There were ongoing investigations, but it gave them a way out to duck questions. So Congress honestly didn't do a very good job of exercising their oversight. And that's one reason that, more heads didn't roll in the Navy and why the Navy hasn't felt that pressure to change their culture.
Interesting, because they're all over the Pentagon.
Thank you.
I was a Navy JAG officer in the early 90s, going up close to 2000, and I made one Westpac. And a lot of what you've described doesn't surprise me. I don't find it shocking. Junior officers or sailors, when you're traveling around the Pacific and you're going to a lot of foreign countries and everything, and you've maybe never really been outside the United States before you do that, if you come into contact with someone who is very pro-American and steeped in American culture and friendly, you're going to be very receptive to that, because you're also encountering a lot of looks and, just the vibe that you get from a lot of people is very anti-American. So if someone is not that, you're going to immediately, your defenses might drop. With regard to there being a lot of involvement from admirals and not very many of them paying a price, that doesn't surprise me, because admirals are general court-martial authorities, so they're judged by their peers, and they're going to get the most sympathetic look at any kind of problems. So on the few occasions when I was firsthand aware of one flag officer looking at another flag officer's conduct and deciding what to do about it to correct it, it's amazing to me how sympathetic that review was. But as far as trying to fix problems, just focusing on, I would hope that people would try to be sympathetic about their rank and file junior officers or sailors. Any American thrust into other parts of the world trying to do their job. I'm not excusing anything like letting go of secrets. There's times when you would clearly know you're crossing a line. But as far as attending a dinner or something like that, it'd be very easy to get confused.
Right. Thank you for that. That rings true with a lot of the interviews I conducted for the book. And certainly I want to make 2 points. One, the vast majority of people in the Navy aren't like this, like the people who got in trouble or gotten investigated. Most people of upstanding integrity, and the people spotlighted in the book are the exception of the rule, but there were still a lot of them. And frankly, I found since the book has come out that the people get most angry reading this book are Navy veterans and others who have served in the military, because they feel real betrayal by their shipmates.
Good evening. Bravo Zulu on a tremendous expose. I'm actually a Navy contracting officer, so it's a very interesting read, to say the least. As such, I was curious, how complicit were the contracting officers in Singapore? In particular, did they do bid rigging, frivolous change orders post-award, look the other way for rubber stamping invoices, what have you?
They were as complicit as you could get. So the Navy has a contracting office in Singapore, has for decades, which is in charge of putting out for bid contracts for what Leonard's company did and approving them and reviewing the bills. And Leonard figured out early on that if he could find the right person, he could bribe them. So there was one supervising civilian there in the mid-2000s, and Leonard took him out for drinks a few times, and right away he figured out this was a guy he could do business with. So the next time they had drinks, he slipped him an envelope stuffed with $50,000 in cash, right, and said, I want the next contract for the Philippines, or I want the next contract for Australia. So if Leonard had to, he would it was naked bribery, right? He would provide cash, prostitutes, and he would get the contracting officers to essentially be his employees. And you'll see this throughout the book, evidence where people, his moles, whether in the contracting office or Navy officers on ships, would refer to him as boss, right? They would call him boss this, boss that. And they weren't joking. It wasn't ironic. When they would send him text messages or emails, it was, yes, boss, what else can I do for you? They were literally reporting to him. That's the level of command he had over people. So sometimes he could subtly get people to look the other way, but a lot of times he literally had them on his payroll.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you had a statistical workup of how many people got court-martialed or convicted in federal court, how many Fat Leonard's associates got convicted, and how many Article 15s were handed out.
Yeah, a good question. So, and you'll find those details in the book, but there were about 36 people charged in federal court, with corruption-related crimes, including Leonard and several of his lieutenants in his company. There were about another half dozen court martials, and then there were an untold number of people who were investigated by the Navy under Uniform Code of Military Justice for administrative violations, violating ethics rules. And that, by and large, the Navy has kept secret about people who've been reprimanded in private.
Article 15s also.
No Article 15s, as I'm aware of.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, thank you for this presentation and for doing the book and for doing the hard reporting. I've been following the story since the beginning. I grew up in the Virginia Beach area. I'm not affiliated with the Navy, but have friends who were civilian employees. And if not for the Washington Post keeping this story going, like I would go and check the Virginian Pilot every time there was a development reported in the Post. I'd go check the local paper in Norfolk. Not a word about the Fat Leonard scandal. My friends who were high-ranking civilian employees of the Navy knew nothing about this story because they weren't reading the Post. So was there something, do you have any sense of why none of the other media outlets were covering this story? I know it got a little bit in the Times, but not a lot of widespread coverage, and not in Navy towns where the population is ripe for this kind of information.
Well, thank you for noticing the Post coverage. My editor, Dave Fallis, is here, and he's one reason that we got so much coverage. But the Post, understandably saw this as an accountability story, and that it was important to find out what happened and the extent of it. And one reason, frankly, there wasn't more coverage, I think, in other places, it is a hard story. It was very difficult to get information that, you had to spend days and weeks really ferreting out details. The Navy had exactly one press conference in 10 years to answer reporters' questions about the Fat Leonard scandal, and that was way back in December of 2013. And after that, nothing. And the Justice Department wouldn't talk except for its case filings in court. The people under investigation didn't want to talk. Leonard's locked up for, I won't spill all the twists and turns in his saga, but so there were limited places you could go to try and find out more information. It was hard, but there were other news organizations that covered it. Out in San Diego, the Union Tribune dedicated coverage. Nancy wrote about it for the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times wrote some about it. But there is an element to I personally became a little fixated on it, right? I thought it was a great story, an important story. But again, when you're a reporter, you hate being told, we won't comment, we're not going to tell you, it's none of your business. That just kind of fuels the fire a little bit. And fortunately, I worked at a place like the Washington Post where they gave me the time and resources and encouragement to keep digging.
And Craig, I would note that one of the things that you did was file a lot of Freedom of Information Acts to get a lot of the data that we have available. So you weren't just reporting, but really pushing for information to come out, which was so critical to people's understanding of the scandal.
I did, and more than 36 Freedom of Information Act requests. And sometimes the Navy would respond, but finally in the end, they got sick of it. And I got a letter from a high-ranking lawyer at the Pentagon who said, zip it, we don't want you to file any more of these. We're going to not respond because this is an ongoing case. That was their excuse. And even though I argue, I said, look, it's your own regulations say you're supposed to put out information if a commanding officer or a senior officer is found guilty of misconduct internally. But they said, we don't care, we're not going to respond. I ended up having to sue under the Freedom of Information Act. I filed my own lawsuit in federal court. They still fought that. So it was very, very difficult. They did everything they could to block it. So I think that's one reason, too, why there wasn't more coverage elsewhere.
And then these two thank you, sir. And then these two gentlemen will have our last two questions.
Yes, this scandal went on for so long. What I'm curious about is why were there no whistleblowers of notable,
So great question. And in the book, you'll hear some stories of some whistleblowers and some who did try and do the right thing. And invariably, most of them would get squashed. And Leonard, again, like I described before, he had these informants and moles and people called him boss. So if there was a whistleblower, usually they were lower ranking people, a supply officer who would notice that the bill was 3 times what it should be. And they would confront Leonard over this, or they would report it up the chain of command. They were almost always silenced or squashed. And there's one great running story about one of Leonard's antagonists over many years who's described in the book. And Leonard saw this guy who was a captain in the Navy as a real threat to his company because he understood what was going on. And there's this real cat and mouse game playing out where Leonard was constantly trying to squash the whistleblower or whistleblowers. And by and large, he always succeeded for the most part. But that's a constant tension. But Leonard, again, he was a very, very talented criminal, and he had his tentacles throughout the Navy, and he's always good at sussing out whenever there was a threat and extinguishing it. So there were people who tried to do the right thing. It wasn't that there weren't, but Leonard, by and large, got the best of them.
Did the Navy use the mental health excuse for these whistleblowers?
No, I didn't find
see
that at all.
anything
They
of
just, but the Navy has different ways of making people keep quiet. Leonard was also, he was so well connected at the upper ranks of the Navy that he would invariably call an admiral friend or a captain or a high-ranking civilian to get somebody lower ranking silenced. So he knew how to work the system that way.
Okay, thank you. Good job.
Thank you, sir.
I have a quick question. I saw that about a month ago, 5 Navy officials, their cases were recently dismissed by a judge. How fair do you think the Justice Department has been in all of this?
That's a great question. You're clearly a very smart young man. So the Justice Department did recently, they were forced to take 5 cases of individuals who had already pleaded guilty to fraud and corruption and had to throw them out and let these people plead guilty instead to misdemeanors. And the reason for this is prosecutorial misconduct. So you'll find details in the book, but Leonard was such a good comment. It wasn't just that he conned the Navy, he conned the Justice Department. He became a cooperating witness, and the Justice Department got overconfident in trying to prosecute some of these cases, and they committed misconduct and didn't afford a fair trial. And that has caused all the convictions to come unraveled, or at least to come under new scrutiny. So the irony is, in the end, despite this being the biggest, most extensive corruption scandal in Navy history, a lot of the people are going to get away with it.
Well, I want to thank you, Craig, not just for this talk and not just for this book, but for really committing to covering this, because you understood, I think, better than most how important this was to our job as reporters, but also for the public's right to know. So I just want to ask our audience, I'm going to invite everyone to come and get their copy of the book signed, but I just want to ask you to help me thank Craig for his work on this topic, not only today, but over the past decade.
And thanks to you, Nancy. It's been a real pleasure and privilege having this discussion with you, and couldn't put it any better. So thanks so much.
Thank you.